The bottle hit the table harder than Chloe intended. Not hard enough to break anything, just hard enough to make the man across from her flinch. And that was exactly what she wanted. He had been talking for the last 4 minutes. Laughing, really. Him and the 3 men beside him, passing cruel words back and forth in Korean, like a game they were playing just above her head, certain she couldn't reach it, certain she couldn't understand a single syllable falling out of their mouths. Certain that the full-figured black American woman refilling their glasses was nothing more than furniture with a uniform on. The restaurant around them hummed with the particular quiet of expensive things. Ganjang was the kind of establishment where the lighting cost more per hour than most people made in a day, where the chopsticks were hand-lacquered and the silence between courses felt curated and intentional, where the clientele were chaebols and foreign ministers and the kind of people who had never once in their lives stood in a line. Chloe had worked here for 2 years, and in that time she had learned exactly 2 things about people like these. They loved being seen, and they absolutely hated being surprised. She was about to surprise someone. She set the bottle down, straightened, turned to face the man who had just directed something unspeakable at her face, grinning as he said it, savouring it, certain the words would pass through her like rain through an open window. Meaningless, invisible, landing nowhere because she was nowhere, because she was nobody. In perfect, rough, gritty Busan dialect, not the clean Korean of textbooks and television dramas, but the salt and diesel language of dock workers and fish market vendors, and the backs of cargo trucks at 3 a.m., Chloe said calmly and without raising her voice even a single degree. Your mother raised you in a fish market, and it shows. I would recommend the broth this evening. It is genuinely the only thing on the menu suited to your level of refinement. The table stopped existing for a moment, not the comfortable, curated silence of Ganjang's expensive air. Something different entirely. The silence that descends when a room realizes the ground has moved and nobody yet knows how far. The man stared at her. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His brain, she could see, was performing rapid and unsuccessful calculations. Soo-yeon, seated at the left end of the table, lean, sharp-faced, watchful in the way of a man who had spent 11 years being paid to notice everything, pressed 2 fingers against his mouth. His shoulders moved once. He was laughing, completely silently, with the practiced iron control of someone who had learned a long time ago that amusement at the wrong moment was a professional liability. But he was absolutely, completely laughing. The man who had spoken rose from his chair with the slow, pressurized movement of someone who had decided that humiliation required a physical answer, and then a hand came down flat on the table. One hand, one sound, no louder than a book being set down at the end of a long day. And every single man at that table sat back down as though strings had been cut simultaneously. Chloe looked at the hand. Then she looked at the man it belonged to. Jin-ho Kwon had not changed his posture, had not raised his voice, had not leaned forward, had not done anything that looked like effort or exertion. His jacket was still perfect. His expression was still composed. The menu was still held loosely in his other hand, as though none of the last 30 seconds had interrupted anything. But he had lifted his eyes to Chloe, and what was in them stopped her in a way she had not been stopped in 2 years. He was not looking at her the way his men had been looking at her. Not with contempt. Not with the lazy cruelty of men who have never once had to account for themselves. He was looking at her with the focused, careful attention of someone who has just encountered something their existing categories cannot accommodate. Something that requires new thinking, something genuinely, unexpectedly interesting, with the lazy cruelty of men who have never once had to account for themselves. He was looking at her with the focused, careful attention of someone who has just encountered something their existing categories cannot accommodate, something that requires new thinking, something genuinely, unexpectedly interesting. He looked at her the way her father used to look at a problem he actually wanted to solve. Chloe held his gaze for 1 second, exactly one, no more, and then picked up her tray and walked away. Behind her, barely audible beneath the resumed ambient sound of the restaurant, she heard him say to Soo-yeon, "Find out who she is." She did not look back. But when she reached the service station and set the tray down, her hands were not entirely steady, and she stood there for a moment longer than necessary looking at nothing, feeling something move through her chest that she had no current category for either. Something warm and inconvenient and completely unwelcome that she had not felt in 2 years of careful, constructed numbness. She found the card when she cleared the table 40 minutes later, tucked beneath the edge of the bill. Crisp, white, 4 words in small, precise handwriting that looked like the writing of a man who did everything with exactness. "You are wasted here." And below that, a phone number. She stood in the middle of the restaurant floor and read it 3 times. Around her, ganjang continued its expensive evening, the soft percussion of good cutlery, the murmur of significant deals being made in pleasant voices, the faint distant note of a gayagayam being played somewhere out of sight. She stood in the middle of all of it and read 4 words and felt the ground shift beneath her carefully constructed life in a way she could not stop and was not entirely sure she wanted to. In the break room, alone, she sat on the bench in front of her locker and pressed the card flat against her palm and thought about her father. Samuel Harford had been a force of nature wearing the face of a mild-mannered man, a black American from Virginia who had learned Korean during his army years in the late 1980s and fallen so completely and irrevocably in love with the country and the language and the people that Korea had eventually become more home to him than anywhere else on Earth. He had come back in his 30s and built a life there. 2 lives, really. The legitimate one was a logistics consulting firm with offices in Busan and Incheon, highly regarded, impeccably run. The other life was something that 2 American intelligence agencies and the Korean authorities had been trying to formally and conclusively categorize for the better part of a decade. Samuel knew which port officials could be talked to and which ones were already bought. He knew which shipping lanes could move cargo that didn't appear on any manifest and which customs checkpoints experienced what you might call technical difficulties on certain Tuesday mornings. He knew how to walk into any room in any country and within 20 minutes understand who owed what to whom, who was afraid of what, who wanted what badly enough to make significant accommodations. He had a gift for people, a genuine, warm, almost reckless interest in them, that made everyone trust him faster and more completely than was wise. He had leveraged that trust with a precision that was, in its own way, almost beautiful. In the circles that knew his name, and they were circles that most people never knew existed, they called him the architect. He had taught Chloe everything at a kitchen table in Virginia, across years of school holidays, with flashcards and bad jokes and an infinite joyful patience. Korean first, then Mandarin, then Japanese. Then the deeper grammar. How power actually moved versus how it presented itself publicly. How to read a room's real conversation underneath the one being spoken aloud. How to identify the person in any group who was actually making the decisions versus the one who merely appeared to be. He had taught her all of it with the same warmth and thoroughness with which he'd taught her to ride a bicycle, as though these were simply the skills a person needed to move through the world well. 3 years ago, Victor Yoon had ordered him killed. A crane malfunction at a Jeju Island shipping facility. Staged with enough technical competence that the official investigation concluded it was a tragic industrial accident, found nothing worth pursuing, and closed in 6 weeks. Chloe had been in Langley when the report came through her screen. She had been a US intelligence analyst at the time, running an operation that was, in its private moments, a case she was painstakingly building against her own father, trying to assemble enough documented evidence to give him a choice between prosecution and coming home before his choices caught up with him entirely. She had been trying to save him the only way her professional life allowed. Then the Jeju Island report scrolled across her screen, and she understood in the space of 3 seconds that saving him was no longer possible. She had burned her identity that same week, changed her name, gained weight deliberately, not from grief, though grief was present, but as a calculated operational decision, the kind her training had prepared her for. Alter your silhouette. Alter your profile. Become someone the people looking for you would not recognize if they stood next to you in a restaurant. She had disappeared into Seoul on a forged residency card under a name she had taken from a woman who died in 1987. She had not come to Seoul to hide forever. She had come because Victor Yoon was in Seoul, and she was waiting with the long patience her father had also taught her, for the right weapon. She had not planned for Jin-ho Kwon. She put the card in her apron pocket, went home, lay in her small Mapo apartment, listening to Seoul breathe outside her window, and stared at the ceiling and thought about eyes that looked at her like a problem worth solving, and was not pleased with herself, and did it anyway until morning came grey and indifferent through her curtains. He came back the next night, and the night after that, always requesting her section, which sent the maitre d' into a state of barely contained bewilderment. Jin-ho Kwon requesting a specific waitress was, apparently, an event without precedent. The maitre d' relayed this information to Chloe with wide eyes and the slightly panicked energy of a man watching something happen that was above his authority to manage. The second night, Jin-ho looked up at her and said, in clean, precise Mandarin, "The chrysanthemum tea. Is it the Hangzhou variety or the Huangshan?" she answered in Mandarin without pausing. Hangzhou. The Huangshan was out of season, and what remained from the last order was past its optimal steeping window. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Deeper than surprise. The particular quality of a person hearing a calculation confirmed that they had been quietly running for days. He tried her in Japanese. She held. He shifted to a Taiwanese Mandarin dialect, watching her face with absolute attention for the fracture point. There was no fracture point. He stopped testing. He started talking. And somewhere between the first course and the second, Chloe realized, with the slow, careful alarm of someone noticing they have already walked further into a forest than they intended, that the conversation had changed registers without her noticing. He asked her what she would change about the restaurant if she could change anything. She told him the lighting over the east wall ran 2 degrees too cool and made the lacquerwork look cheap. He turned to study the wall for a long, quiet moment, then looked back at her and said, simply, "You're right." The way he said it, not conceding a point, but confirming something he had already half thought, landed somewhere she was not prepared for it to land. On the third night, he said something under his breath, timed precisely to when she was leaning across to pour, about the trade ambassador at table 11. It was so dry and so precisely observed and so completely unexpected from a man of his particular composure that the laugh came out of her before she could catch it. She recovered fast, professional, smooth, calm. But she had seen his expression in the half-second before she recovered. Something in it had opened, just slightly, just enough for light. Soo-yeon lingered after Jin-ho left that third night, signing the receipt with unhurried care. He looked up at Chloe with the direct, measuring attention of a man who is professionally obligated to notice things and personally inclined to act on them. "In 11 years, Soo-yeon said, he has never returned to the same restaurant twice, not once. I keep his calendar. I would know." He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should be aware of that." He left before she could find an answer. On the fourth night, Jin-ho arrived early and sat, and within the first 20 minutes made her laugh again. Properly this time, fully, a laugh she genuinely could not intercept before it was already out. She saw the warmth that moved through his face when she laughed, and it was different from everything else she had observed in him. Softer, less controlled, like something that belonged to a person he used to be before he built himself into what he was now. After he left, she stood in the break room for 6 minutes doing nothing at all. Just standing. Which was not a thing she did. Chloe Harford was not a woman who stood in rooms doing nothing. She was finding increasingly that Jin Ho Kwon was producing effects in her that she did not have a protocol for. The envelope that night contained 5 million won and a card with 5 words. "You are wasted here. Call me." She put it in her pocket with the first card. She was keeping them both and she knew exactly what that meant and she kept them anyway. If this story already has you, and I think it does, subscribe right now. Hit the bell. This channel tells stories that stay with you long after you stop watching. You want to be here for all of them. Soo-yeon came to the break room before the morning shift 6 days later. He sat across from her at the small metal table and placed 3 photographs between them without saying anything first. With the practiced efficiency of a man who had delivered difficult information many times and had learned that preamble helped no one. Her real passport, Samuel Harford's face, a photograph from 8 years ago, him laughing at something off camera with the full, unguarded joy of a man who found the world genuinely delightful. And a dossier of considerable thickness. Chloe looked at the photographs for a moment. Then she slid them back across the table without touching them. "He wants to know," Soo-yeon said carefully, "whether you are a threat or an asset." "Tell him," Chloe said, "that those aren't mutually exclusive." Soo-yeon studied her for a long moment with the focused attention of a man reading a document he may be asked to testify about later. Then something in his expression shifted, not quite approval but adjacent to it, the way a door shifts when the latch catches. "He'll want to hear that himself," Soo-yeon said. That night the restaurant emptied and the staff went home, and Chloe walked into the private dining room at the back of Ganjang and found Jin Ho Kwon waiting. He had his jacket off for the first time, sleeves rolled to the forearm. There was something in that small informality, this precise, thoroughly self-contained man, slightly undone at the edges, that made the room feel different than she had prepared herself for. More honest, smaller in the way that private things are smaller than public ones. He told her about the cipher. In the final months of his life, Samuel Harford had assembled everything he knew into a single encrypted map of catastrophic strategic value. Every corrupt port official in Yoon's network, every ghost cargo channel, every shell company and transit window, and coded contact, organized with the elegant, systematic precision of a man who thought in architectures. A weapon made entirely of information, which Samuel had always understood to be the most dangerous kind. He had constructed it in his own notation, committed it entirely to memory, and had been preparing the handover when Yoon moved first. Jin Ho had spent 3 years attempting to reconstruct it. His intelligence operation was formidable. It was not enough. The cipher was in a language only one person left alive had been taught. He looked at her with the level directness that she had come to understand was his version of openness. "Your father memorized it. I believe he taught it to you." The silence between them carried more than strategy. It carried 3 weeks of restaurant nights and cards kept in apron pockets, and a laugh she hadn't been able to intercept, and 2 people who had been circling something neither had yet named. "What do I get?" Chloe asked. "Yoon." She held his gaze. Neither of them looked away. The distance across the table felt very short. "Then we have a deal." He extended his hand. She took it. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes last, and neither of them was the one to pull away first, and both of them knew exactly what that meant. His compound on the Han River was everything Ganjang was not, and everything she might have predicted for a man like him. All dark wood and glass and clean, deliberate lines, the city spread below it like light spilled across a circuit board. Beautiful, she thought, in the way of spaces that have been built for function rather than feeling. Every room knew its purpose. None of them had remembered to be warm. She set up at the glass board in the strategy room and began. The cipher came back the way things come back that your father put into you. Not as a list, but as a texture, a rhythm, a language running underneath language. Port codes and transit windows and officials organised by rank and bribery tier. Shell companies mapped to real cargo lanes, ghost vessels registered to names that traced back to nothing. Chloe wrote it out in Samuel's shorthand, English and Korean woven together with his personal notation system, a language of one that she had learned at a kitchen table in Virginia while he told her she was the smartest person he had ever met, and she had rolled her eyes and kept writing. And Jinho's analysts crowded the room and struggled visibly to keep pace. Jinho stood back from it all. He watched her. She could feel his eyes. Had always been able to feel them from the very first night in the restaurant, with a specificity she could not account for and had stopped trying to justify. But this was different from the restaurant. This was not the careful evaluating attention of a man deciding what to do with something unknown. This was something quieter and more settled. Something that had made a decision without announcing it. Late that first night at the compound, when the analysts had gone and the board was covered in her father's ghost language and the city hummed far below them, they ended up standing side by side at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Han River. Seoul glittered like scattered coins across black water. "You could have run," Jinho said, quietly. Not an accusation, an observation offered with something close to respect. "Running means he wins. Most people," he said, "find a version of running they can rename. Moving on, starting fresh. They call the retreat something else and live inside the new name." A pause. "You didn't." She turned to look at him. "Are you safe, Jinho?" The first time she had used his given name. They both felt the small atmospheric shift that a name creates when it is finally spoken instead of implied. He was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not the performative pause of a man accustomed to controlling conversations. "No," he said finally. "I haven't been safe in a long time." Another pause. "I stopped noticing when I was, and when I wasn't. At some point, the vigilance became the baseline, and I lost track of what it had replaced." "I notice every day," she said. "Every room I walk into, I count the exits before I count the chairs. I track who is watching and from where and what they might be carrying. I've done it for so long it doesn't feel like fear anymore. It just feels like how I move through the world." He looked at her steadily. "And yet, you are standing in the most secured compound in Seoul. In the company of a man most of this city crosses streets to avoid." "Maybe," she said quietly. "I got tired of rooms designed for one." He turned toward her fully for the first time, and in his eyes she saw it. The thing that had been there from the restaurant, the thing she had been cataloguing from a careful distance, the thing she had been telling herself was professional and strategic, and not what it actually was. He looked at her the way people look at the thing they had decided to want before they were quite ready to admit they had decided. Their hands rested on the windowsill, his close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth radiating from his without contact. Neither moved away, and the space between stayed and was not nothing, was, in fact, in its precise maintained distance, more charged than contact would have been. The days at the compound ran together in the particular way of days that are both high pressure and somehow suspended from ordinary time. They worked long hours and argued about decryption methodology and logistics sequencing in a way that was also underneath, about the fact that they thought in similar patterns and kept surprising each other by arriving at the same conclusions through completely different routes. She would be mid-thought, and he would complete it, not talking over her, not interrupting, but landing exactly where she was heading and looking at her afterward with an expression that said he was as startled by it as she was. One afternoon she reached past him for a file, and he caught her wrist, the automatic reflex of a man unused to being reached over. and they both went completely still. Neither looked at the point of contact. They looked at each other instead. The moment stretched past the point where either of them could pretend it was accidental and into the territory of deliberate choice, because they were both staying in it now and they both knew they were staying in it, and neither of them moved. Then his phone rang. She took the file. They went back to work. But she could feel the place where his hand had been for the rest of the evening, a warmth that didn't fade, like a word spoken in a language she was still in the process of learning. Soo-yeon brought coffee at midnight, took one look at the two of them sitting 3 inches apart over the same strategic map, with the focused, incandescent energy of two people who were absolutely not talking about the map, and reversed out of the room without a word. In the corridor, he allowed himself one slow nod of profound professional satisfaction. The night before the operation, neither of them could sleep, both too alert, too precisely tuned by years of individual vigilance, too aware of what the next 12 hours would demand and cost. They ended up on the balcony, the Han River black and silver below, the city breathing around them in that vast, indifferent, beautiful way that only very large cities can breathe. Chloe talked about her father. Not the cipher, not the strategy, not any of the operational architecture they had spent 8 days building together. Samuel himself. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he reached the punchline, helplessly, every time. The Korean lullabies he had learned phonetically when she was small and sung with absolute committed gusto, despite understanding perhaps 60% of the words, filling the gaps with serene confidence. The way he could walk into any room in any country and within 20 minutes know everyone's name and what they cared most about and what they were most afraid of, and how those two things were usually the same thing. "The last time I talked to him," she said, "I told him I was coming to bring him home." Her voice was steady. Her hands on the railing were not quite. "He said he was already home, that he had made his world here and it was exactly the world he had wanted and he was proud of every piece of it." She paused. "I was so angry at him. For so long. He had chosen all of it, all the risk and the danger and the distance, over being somewhere I could reach him. And then I couldn't reach him anymore, and all I had was the anger to keep me company." She stopped. "Now I would give almost anything to have one more conversation, to tell him I understand. That the thing he built, messy and imperfect and operating in the dark, it was real. It was entirely his. And I am proud of it too." Jin-ho did not rush to fill the silence. He had a gift for that, she had learned, for giving silence exactly what it required, which was usually space and time and someone willing to stay present inside it without flinching. Then he said, after a long moment, something he had not said to anyone. She knew this not from any declaration he made, but from the quality of the pause before it. The particular stillness of a man stepping past the perimeter of where he usually allowed himself to go. He told her about his father, a man of absolute integrity who had built a small shipping company over 30 careful, honest years and had been systematically destroyed by larger competitors who used lawyers and debt instruments and manipulated contracts, who had operated entirely within legal structures that were nonetheless wielded as weapons. His father had believed in those structures, had believed in courts and due process and the idea that honest men were protected by honest systems. He had spent the last decade of his life losing everything through channels he had trusted, in rooms he couldn't afford, before judges he didn't know were already decided, structures. Had believed in courts and due process and the idea that honest men were protected by honest systems. He had spent the last decade of his life losing everything through channels he had trusted, in rooms he couldn't afford, before judges he didn't know were already decided. "I watched him lose," Jin-ho said quietly. "For 8 years I watched it, and I decided I would never be that exposed. Never that dependent on systems controlled by people who had no stake in my survival. His hands were flat on the railing. So I built something they couldn't reach through legal channels. And then I kept building because I didn't know how to stop. Because stopping felt like the thing that had killed my father. He looked at the river for a long moment. I won. I took everything they could have taken from me and then I kept going. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what I was building toward. A pause. I had not laughed at a dinner table in 4 years before I walked into Ganjang. Chloe looked at him, at the precision and the stillness and the single small crack in it that she appeared to be one of the only people in the world to have been shown, and felt something settle in her chest. Something that recognized him. That said, yes, this one, this person, this is the shape of someone who understands. Is that why you kept coming back? She asked softly. That first week? I came back, he said, slowly, as though finding it as he spoke it. Because you were the first person in a very long time who I could not finish reading in the first minute. Every person I meet, I know within 60 seconds what they want and what they fear. You were different. A pause. And then you made me laugh. And I realized I had forgotten what that felt like. To be surprised by someone, to be in a room and have it feel different because of who else was in it. She reached up slowly and tucked a loose curl behind her own ear. A self-conscious gesture, the kind that escapes when a person is being looked at more honestly than they are accustomed to. He saw it. He reached up and did it instead, slowly, giving her every moment to step back. His fingers were warm against her face. She did not step back. Chloe. Just her name. In Korean it sounded slightly different, rounder, more considered, like a word chosen carefully from many options. She turned toward him fully. His phone detonated with alerts. Yoon was moving. The Cheongsan Ho, a ghost vessel registered to his oldest shell company, carrying the physical records that connected him to 20 years of criminal operation, the one cargo he would never entrust to anyone else, was being rerouted to Incheon Terminal. They had 4 hours. The balcony, the river, the warmth of his hand at her face, all of it dissolved in an instant back into operational clarity. But before he turned away, his hand lingered at her jaw for one deliberate extra beat, and he said, low and certain, "When this is over." "When this is over," she said back, and meant it with everything she had left. They went inside, back to work. But something enormous had been named in the space between them, and there was no taking it back, and neither of them wanted to. 2 a.m. Incheon Port Terminal. The rain came in hard off the yellow sea and turned every floodlight into a smeared halo of orange and white. Container cranes rose against the black sky like the stripped skeletons of enormous animals. The terminal smelled of salt and diesel and the specific cold that comes off open water when November decides to mean it. Chloe sat in the back of a black SUV with a tablet, a headset, and the full architecture of her father's documented knowledge of Victor Yoon's operation running through her mind with the clarity of something that had always been waiting to be used. "Gate 7 patrol rotates in 9 minutes, she said into the headset, her voice level and unhurried. The overnight supervisor is on Yoon's payroll. Dock 3 only. He doesn't cover the east approach. Take the east approach. You have a clean window of 6 minutes. Jinho's voice came back even as still water. Confirmed. She rerouted the Port Authority scanner frequency, a blind spot in the communication infrastructure that had existed for 7 years because the official responsible for repairing it was being paid monthly not to. She bought 6 minutes of dead air on the relevant channel. She cross-referenced the Cheongsan Ho's filed cargo manifest against the weight classification discrepancy her father had documented and confirmed with complete certainty that the physical records were on board. "He's there," she said. "He won't trust this shipment to anyone else in the world. He is on that vessel personally." A pause on the line. Then Jinho's voice underneath the operational composure, threaded through with something small and personal. Not enough to be unprofessional, just enough to be human. Copy. One word. She understood everything inside it. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass and watched the rain move in the floodlights, and thought about Samuel Harford standing at a dock like this one 3 years ago. Whether he had known, whether in the final moment he had thought of her. She believed he had. She believed he had thought of her and been at peace in a way she was still working toward, and the thought of it cracked something open in the center of her chest that she breathed through carefully. The way he had taught her to breathe through the things that cost the most, slowly, completely, without looking away from them. Inside the terminal, Jinho's operation moved with the quiet, coordinated efficiency of something built by two precise minds working in complete alignment. The Port Authority patrols moved exactly where Chloe predicted. The blind spots were exactly where her father had documented them 7 years ago. The officials behaved precisely according to their bribe tier. 23 minutes after entry, Yoon was cornered in the cargo hold of the Cheongsan Ho. Chloe got out of the SUV. She walked into the terminal in the rain without hurrying. Her footsteps on the wet concrete were steady and even. This was not a moment she was going to rush. The cargo hold smelled of metal and seawater, and the particular cold of enclosed spaces near the ocean. Yoon stood between two of Jinho's men, and he was smaller than she had imagined, which was always how it went. The architects of enormous damage were always ordinary-sized when you finally got them in a room and removed the apparatus of power they wore like additional height. He looked at her with the rapid recalibrating attention of a man whose calculations had just come back catastrophically wrong. Jinho stood to the side. He watched her walk in. He said nothing and did not move. He understood, completely, and without being told, that this was hers. Chloe stopped in front of Victor Yoon. She looked at him with the specific grounded calm of a woman who has been waiting 3 years for this exact number of feet of space between herself and this exact man, and who is in absolutely no hurry now that she has arrived. In Korean, quiet and level as still water, she said, "Samuel Harford built everything you stole from him. The roots, the relationships, the 20 years of trust he built with people across 4 countries. The cipher you killed him to suppress." She took one step forward. "I memorized every piece of it. I reconstructed everything in 8 days. And right now, 3 Korean prosecutors, who have been waiting years for exactly this evidence package, are receiving it on their secured servers." Yoon's jaw was a rigid line. He said nothing. He had nothing. "He died," Chloe said, "knowing you would never find it. I lived knowing I would." She looked at him for a long final moment. "I want you alive for every day of what comes next. Every hearing, every document read aloud, every name on that manifest spoken in a courtroom. I want you present for all of it. For years." She stepped back. She nodded to Jinho's men. She walked out of the cargo hold into the rain and did not look back. There was nothing behind her any more worth looking at. They stood on the dock after. The rain had softened to mist. The sky over Incheon at its far eastern edge was beginning, slowly and without commitment, to suggest the idea of morning, a thin grey-blue line along the horizon, pale against all that darkness. Jinho stood beside her. Not in front, not a half step behind, not positioned in the way of a man who leads. Beside her, level, equal. "It's done," he said. Chloe nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and then another moment, and then she felt it coming the way her father had always told her grief came. Like weather, he used to say. You cannot stop it and you cannot outrun it, and the only thing to do is stand still and let it move through you completely. The tears came without drama, without collapse or spectacle, just tears, moving quietly down her face in the cold air. For the man who had sung her Korean lullabies, he didn't fully understand. For the last phone call, for 3 years of carrying his work and his voice and his unfinished business through cities where she did not fully exist. For the conversations she would never get to have now and the things she would never get to say. For the relief, also. The enormous, exhausting, long-awaited relief. Jin-ho turned toward her. He looked at her face. At the tears she wasn't hiding, at the exhaustion and the grief, and the years of controlled stillness finally and completely releasing. And he did not look away, did not offer words, did not try to manage the moment, or fix it, or redirect it into something more comfortable. He seemed to know, with the accuracy that had surprised her since the beginning, that words were entirely wrong for this, that the only right thing was presence. He opened his arms. She stepped into them. He held her with the careful, slightly unfamiliar tenderness of a man who has not held another person in a long time and is remembering how. Carefully at first, then with increasing certainty, both arms coming around her with a warmth that felt like a decision being made in real time. She felt him exhale, long and slow and from somewhere deep in him, like a man finally setting down something heavy that he had been carrying so long he had stopped feeling the weight. They stood like that on the dock in the mist, while Incheon moved around them and the sky kept slowly, gently lightening at its edges, and Seoul breathed in the distance, enormous and indifferent and alive. If you have been holding your breath through this story, I see you. Drop a comment right now. Tell me which moment got you. And if you are watching this and you are still not subscribed, hit that button. Hit the bell. The next story on this channel is going to do the same thing to you, and you should be here for it. Back at the compound, daylight came through the glass walls for the first time and made everything look different. The hard, precise angles of the rooms softened in morning light. The spaces looked less like a fortress and more just slightly like somewhere a person might actually want to live. Jin-ho made the offer formally across the strategy table, Director of Logistics and Intelligence for the Kwon Hee-sang organization. Chloe negotiated with the same precision she brought to everything. Full operational autonomy over her department, a seat at every strategic meeting regardless of subject, and immediate legal protection for 3 surviving members of her father's network who remained exposed in Busan. She laid out each condition clearly, without apology, in the tone of a woman who has spent 3 years earning the right to take up exactly as much space as she needs. He agreed to every condition without hesitation, without negotiating back, without the slight performative resistance that men in his position usually employed simply to remind you they could. Then the professional architecture of the conversation ran out, and there was nothing left to conduct. Just the 2 of them in the morning light, with no crisis between them for the first time since she had walked into that private dining room, and 3 weeks of everything accumulated in the room like a third presence that was done being patient. Jin-ho came around the table. He crossed the space between them deliberately, unhurried, with the quiet intentionality of a man who had made a decision he was not second-guessing. No phone in his hand, no interruption available, no crisis to redirect them. Just him, moving toward her, and her staying exactly where she was. "I meant everything I said on the balcony," he said. "Which part?" she asked. "All of it." He looked at her steadily, with the complete direct attention that she had learned was his most honest register. "But mostly, I don't want you to disappear. I spent 3 years looking for your father's cipher. I have no interest in spending the next 3 looking for you." Chloe looked at him for a long moment, at the precise composed face and the thing underneath it that was neither precise nor composed. That was, in fact, the least composed she had ever seen him, which was exactly as composed as most people on their best days. She reached up and straightened his collar. A small, quiet, entirely domestic gesture. The kind of thing you do for someone you have already decided belongs to you. "Then don't lose me," she said. He kissed her with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been composing this moment for weeks and was finally, without interruption, able to say it. She kissed him back with 3 years of constructed stillness and careful invisibility and deliberate smallness dissolving all at once into something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like moving forward, like choosing a direction, like the future instead of the past. That evening, Ganjang was closed to the public. Chloe had asked for an hour in the restaurant. Jin Ho had made one call and the hour appeared and no further explanation was required by anyone. She sat at his usual table. His chair, the one she had approached 100 times carrying wine and menus, and her most carefully invisible face. He sat across from her in the seat that had always been hers to approach from. The reversal was quiet and complete, and said everything that needed saying without a word. She poured Maggioli into 2 glasses. The sound of it in the empty restaurant was the only sound in the room. She slid 1 glass across the dark lacquered wood toward him. He took it. He looked at her across the small golden distance between them, and in his eyes she could see what she felt reflected back, the strange, improbable, entirely unplanned peace of 2 people who have arrived somewhere neither of them intended and found it, against all reasonable expectation, exactly right. They raised their glasses. She thought about Samuel Harford. She thought about him sitting at a table like this one. And he would have loved this restaurant, the ceremony of it, the lacquer work, the way the service moved like choreography, and laughing too loudly at his own jokes and charming every person in the room inside of 20 minutes, and then leaning across to her and saying something devastatingly accurate about everyone present in a voice just low enough that only she could hear. She thought about him looking at Jin Ho and reading him in the first 30 seconds the way he read everyone, and seeing what she had taken 3 weeks to see, and probably making Jin Ho laugh against his will within the first hour. She thought he would have approved. She thought he would have said, in the particular way he said the things he was most certain of, quietly, without fanfare, as though he were telling her something she already knew, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought he knew. Wherever he was, across whatever distance separated them now, she thought Samuel Harford knew that his daughter was sitting in a restaurant in Seoul in the chair that used to belong to someone else, and was not running anymore, and was not invisible anymore, and was not waiting anymore, and was proud of it. She had come to Seoul as a ghost, a woman who had made herself deliberately small and deliberately unmemorable and deliberately unreachable, who had changed her name and reshaped her silhouette and walked through 2 years of a borrowed life in a city that didn't know her real one, who had carried her father's cipher in her memory and her father's murder in her chest and moved through it all alone, without the luxury of being known by anyone. She had not planned for any of what followed. Had not planned for a man in a charcoal suit who tested her in 4 languages across 4 nights and came back every time. Had not planned for cards kept in apron pockets or a laugh she couldn't intercept, or conversations at compound windows overlooking a river at midnight. Had not planned for a balcony in the cold where 2 people who had each spent years building walls finally, carefully, began showing each other the doors. She had not planned to want something new, had not planned to discover that the thing she had been waiting for was not only justice but this, a table, a glass, a man across from her who had looked at her from the beginning, not as furniture but as a force. But Samuel Harford's daughter had always been better at building things than running from them. He had taught her that at a kitchen table in Virginia with flashcards and bad jokes and the absolute unshakable conviction of a father who knew exactly what his daughter was made of, even before she did. She understood it now, all of it. Every choice he had made, every risk he had taken, every bridge he had built across waters that most people wouldn't have crossed. She understood it and she was proud of it, and she was going to spend the rest of her life building something worthy of it. For the first time in 3 years, Chloe Harford, not the ghost, not the invisible woman, not the waitress, not the person hiding inside a borrowed name in a city that didn't know her, was exactly where she had chosen to be. She was home. if you made it to the very last word of this story. You are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you. The restaurant, the balcony, the dock in the rain? Tell me. And if you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, this is your moment. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, because the next story is already being written and it is going to hit you just as hard. Like this video if you want to see what happens next for Chloe and Jinho. If enough of you say yes, their story continues. See you in the next one.